Once upon a time, jobs were a partnership, a two-sided relationship between employees and employers, where employees would work hard and be loyal, and in return, employers would provide them with stability and good benefits. Both sides gave something and got something, and although this relationship was nowhere near perfect, it created something extraordinary: the American middle class, where millions of ordinary workers were able to work with dignity, live comfortably, and have a bright future. However, somewhere along the way, this relationship started to fade and look a lot more one-sided, because while companies were getting a whole lot richer, workers were starting to get poorer. According to the Economic Policy Institute. From 1978 to 2023, the realized compensation of top CEOs went up by 1,085%, while typical workers only grew by 24%. Since 1973, worker productivity and wages have drastically disconnected, and over time union membership has declined, benefits have weakened, and lifetime employment has become a relic of the past. And so the question of this video is, why do jobs keep getting shittier? How did this social contract between employers and employees get severed? Well, in this video, that's the story I want to tell, because the story of the middle class getting left behind is a rise and fall tale, where for decades workers fought for that relationship, and decades after, policies and decisions would sever it. And so, as it is with all stories, in order to understand the ending, we first need to go back to the beginning, when jobs looked nothing like they do today. Chapter 1, before jobs were called jobs. To understand how the modern job fell apart, we first need to understand how it began. The idea of a job, with hours, wages, and expectations, is actually a modern invention. In early American history, a job wasn't something you had, but it was life itself. Most people were farmers, as well as worked in the trades. Work followed natural rhythms, not schedules. The goal was subsistence, not profit, and work was communal, not some distant company. In the beginning of American history, people didn't work jobs, but they worked to survive, to provide, and to sustain the people they loved. But as the country started to develop, the idea of working for someone else on a larger scale appeared, and it was a system called the cottage industry, where a merchant would distribute raw materials to family like raw wool. Those families would then spin and weave it into fabric, and then the merchant would buy the finished goods and sell them in the broader market. They were sort of like decentralized factories, because instead of having one central location and a workforce to spin and weave the fabric, multiple families could just do it in their homes. And people did this because it supplemented their income during the off-season. The work was still very independent, and the whole family could contribute. The cottage industry was one of the first concepts of working for someone else on a much larger scale. But over time, as demand for consumer goods increased, merchants wanted faster, cheaper, and more consistent production. And that's when labor started to become a commodity. Chapter 2, the birth of the bad job. By the early 1800s, America was industrializing, and inventions like the steam engine, the power loom, and the cotton gin allowed mass production. And with this wave of innovation came a massive transformation on how people worked. Families who once worked at home began leaving their rural towns and moving to cities in search of opportunity. And this is really when people started to see work as a job, because unlike before, where people would use their skills to create tangible goods and direct results, people were now trading their time for a paycheck. And this work looked very different than what they were doing before. Instead of working by the suns or seasons, workers now lived by the clock that told them when to start, eat, and stop. Instead of working alongside family, people worked alongside strangers and supervisors in a crowded factory. And instead of finding fulfillment in their craft, people were doing repetitive, monotonous tasks. Work was different than before. People were chasing opportunity, but what they actually found were some of the first bad jobs. The average work week in a factory was over 12-hour days, 6 days a week. Factories were dark, unventilated, and dangerous. Injuries were common, pay was low, and entire families had to work just to get by. And while workers were struggling to get by, the owners at the top, like Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, grew incredibly rich. But instead of seeing this inequality as a problem, they saw it as proof of their superiority under a belief known as social Darwinism, which is the idea that society worked just like nature, only the strongest would survive and succeed, and wealth was a sign of strength and intelligence, while poverty was evidence of weakness and laziness. It justified this new American greed, but not everyone accepted this new world order. Instead, many workers were being pushed to the point where they started to demand change. Chapter 3, The Rise of Workers' Rights. Up to this point in our story, workers didn't really have any rights. There were no safety standards, no limits on hours, and no guarantee of fair pay. However, by the early 1900s, these cracks really started to show. One of the first cracks was in 1911, when the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City caught on fire. And because factory doors were locked to prevent people from taking breaks, 146 garment workers died. That event exposed what factory life had become: dangerous, dehumanizing, and unregulated. And this event created the start of workplace laws with safety codes, factory inspection, and employment rules. But what it also did was unite workers. More than 350,000 people marched in the funeral procession of the Triangle victims. And as the 1910s unfolded, more workers began to organize and demand change in numbers, but of course, not without pushback. In 1912, there was the Lawrence textile strike in Massachusetts, where mill owners cut workers' pay. Many workers walked off the job in strike. Police and militia beat the strikers, but after 9 weeks, the workers won higher pay. And over time, unions like the American Federation of Labor and Industrial Workers of the World grew stronger, uniting workers. And then the Great Depression hit. Millions of workers lost their jobs and were in breadlines, and those who kept their jobs faced pay cuts and insecurity. And this is when America was really at a pivotal moment and really needed some change. And that's when President Franklin D. Roosevelt won, running on the New Deal. And over time, a series of legislation was passed that would defend the worker. In 1933, the National Industrial Recovery Act granted workers the right to organize and bargain collectively. In 1935, the Wagner Act legalized unions and banned retaliation for organizing. And in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act established a federal minimum wage, overtime pay, and regulations on child labor. For the first time, the law stood for the worker, and as time passed, America would enter its peak of its labor story. Chapter 4, The Golden Age of American Workers. The next part of our labor story begins in the 1940s when World War II was going on. As World War II was entering its peak, in order to combat inflation, President Roosevelt passed the Stabilization Act of 1942 that froze prices, wages, and salaries. And one side effect that came from these freezes was the rise of the good job benefits package. Because while companies couldn't offer higher pay, they could offer benefits like health insurance, pensions, and paid vacation, which eventually became the standard for good jobs. And as the war ended, America entered this period of incredible prosperity. Factories transitioned from making war materials to consumer goods, creating jobs. The GI Bill allowed social mobility, and union membership was at an all-time high, fighting for the worker. After decades of struggle, exploitation, and reform, work finally felt like a partnership. Employers invested in their workers, and workers invested in their job. And because of this strong partnership, the middle class was stronger than ever. One income could buy a home, a car, appliances, and a vacation. However, of course, this prosperity wasn't shared by everyone. If you weren't a white man, you probably didn't enjoy this prosperity. But this period was the height of America's labor story. But all good things must come to an end. And as we entered the 1970s, we would start to move backwards again. Chapter 5, when wages no longer kept up. Alright, up to this point in our story, we have watched things build up to where we are now, but from here on out, we're going to watch things slowly start to unravel. You see, after World War II, productivity and wages grew together, meaning when workers produced more, they earned more. But in 1973, for the first time in 30 years, that connection broke. And there wasn't one thing that caused this, but there were multiple things that happened simultaneously. Oil prices spiked after the OPEC embargo, inflation skyrocketed, eating up wages, and unemployment rose. And also, competition in the world market was back and stronger than ever. Countries like Japan and Germany were now producing cars, electronics, and machinery that competed with American products. And instead of investing in research and workers to compete, companies began cutting costs, moving production overseas, and automating jobs. And that's when something fundamentally changed between companies and their workers. You see, for decades, companies had seen their workers as long-term investments that should share benefits. But by the late 70s, companies started viewing their workers as expenses that needed to be cut. And this belief was called shareholder value, which is the idea that a company's only real responsibility is to maximize returns for its shareholders. And under this system, profit became the measure of success, and the stock market became the scoreboard. And this shift changed everything. CEOs were now rewarded for cutting costs, laying off workers, and outsourcing jobs. Work was no longer this relationship with people, but it was this transaction of numbers. And workers were struggling to rise up like they did in the past as union membership was on the decline. In 1981, air traffic controllers went on strike, and upon refusing to end the strike, Ronald Reagan ended up firing 11,000 workers, sending a message that unions were no longer untouchable. And those firings wasn't just the end of a strike, but it was the end of an era. You see, from that point on, the story of work was no longer written by workers, but it was written by markets that traded labor like any other asset. Chapter 6, the financialization of work. By the 1980s, the American economy had entered a new era. Firstly, there was a new president with a completely new rhetoric.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. It is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden.
Reagan believed that unleashing the free market would allow us to get out of the terrible decade that was the 70s, and his policy, later known as trickle-down economics, believed in cutting taxes for the wealthy and deregulating business, and the benefits would eventually trickle down to the workers. And cut taxes he did. In 1981, he lowered the top tax bracket from 70% to 50%. And in 1986, he reduced it to 28%. In Reagan's deregulation, it didn't just open up the free markets, but it unleashed a new era of financial engineering. On Wall Street, a young banker named Michael Milton pioneered the high-yield bond, which later became known as the junk bond, which is basically a loan to companies with poor credit, but that risk came with potentially higher returns. And these junk bonds gave investors a new power. They could raise billions of dollars to buy up companies to extract a quick profit. And then entered corporate raiders, who were investors that specialized in hostile corporate takeovers. They used junk bond debt to seize control of companies, then broke them apart, sold off divisions, and laid off workers to extract quick profits. It was no longer about building a sustainable business, but it was about manipulating numbers to make a quick buck. And very soon, the government would give Wall Street a new tool to manipulate numbers. In 1982, the SEC legalized stock buybacks, where instead of using profits to raise wages, invest in research, or expand production, companies could use it to buy back shares in the stock market, which would increase the stock price and make shareholders richer. By the end of the 80s, Wall Street wasn't just influencing corporate America, but it was corporate America, and corporate American culture had shifted. Layoffs became efficient, good jobs became targets, debt replaced stability, and workers worked in a culture of fear. And soon after, Washington would open up the floodgates to continue the dismantling of the American worker. Chapter 7, Offshoring. By the 1990s, corporate America made a transformation on how it did business. Instead of making products to earn a profit and using those profits to reinvest in research and workers, companies now focused on hollowing out their own company to make a profit and then using that profit to inflate their stock price and make shareholders richer. And when cutting costs became the new growth strategy, the next logical step is to move somewhere cheaper. Because even if you cut your labor force by 25%, that remaining 75% is still expecting a decent American salary and benefits. Plus, you have to operate under high American standards. But if you move your factories to Mexico or China, you can pay them a fraction of the cost and don't have to deal with the annoying laws and regulations that we fought for 100 years to get. And throughout the 90s, there was a series of policies passed by Washington that would make this possible. And I'm not going to go in big detail in this subject because I did it in this video. You can give that video a watch. But there were two big policies that shipped jobs overseas. The first one was in 1994, NAFTA, that eliminated trade barriers between the US, Mexico, and Canada that allowed corporations to move jobs to Mexico for cheaper labor. The second policy was China entering the World Trade Organization in 2001, giving companies access to dirt cheap labor, a government that welcomed foreign investment, and less regulations. And over time, products did get cheaper, but the American worker got left behind. Millions of manufacturing good jobs disappeared and got shipped overseas and were replaced by bad service jobs. And with jobs being shipped overseas and corporate America constantly chasing a quick buck, we enter Chapter 8, the Age of Precarity. By the 2000s, a lot of progress that we made in the post-World War II golden age was gone. Good jobs were outsourced, unions were weaker than ever, and the middle class was on the decline. And with deregulation continuing to allow Wall Street to make riskier and riskier bets, in 2008, the market crashed. 8.8 million jobs were lost, and the government used taxpayer dollars to bail out the system that caused it. And as we entered the 1910s, we entered this age of precarity where certainty became a privilege and instability became the norm. And over the next 2 decades, companies would try to figure out new ways to shortchange their workers while still getting the job done. Temporary contract roles with no benefits and stability have become more common. Companies have started to classify their employees as 1099 independent contractors to avoid paying benefits. workplace. And gig work has got people fighting over scraps while companies can make more than ever. However, all of this has been branded as being an entrepreneur and having more freedom. But the truth is, people don't feel free. They feel stuck and poorer than ever. People have work, but not careers. They have choices, but no control. They're working harder than ever, but have no security. Companies have been making more than ever, and the GDP, what we consider is our success, continues to grow, but at the expense of the American worker. And more recently, we have entered an even bigger transformation. Chapter 9, the end of work. So now our story leads us to today, in our tech-dominated world that is really threatening how work plays out. Companies need fewer workers than ever to get record profits. AI tools threaten once stable career paths while building their profit off the work of others. And these companies have so much influence that you have to use them in order to participate in the market. And all of this has been sold to us as progress. Instead of creating this equitable system where many reap the benefits, we have created a winner-take-all system where you're either doing very good or barely scraping by, and the middle is rapidly shrinking. The future of life and work look more and more grim every single day, as if it's the end of work. But if there's no work, then how do people survive? And if workers aren't needed to get the job done, how does the economy keep working? And I don't know the answer to those questions. I guess we're just gonna have to see how it all plays out. And so I wanna finish this video off with chapter 10, where do we go from here? All right, another deep dive story in the books. I hope that you all are enjoying these videos as much as I am enjoying making them. Understanding how we got here is fascinating. We have seen the American worker rise when people banded together, and we've seen it fall as America got more greedy. And so, as always, the question is, what do we do with all this information? Well, I think if there's just one lesson this story teaches us, it's that nothing happens on its own. The good job appeared when people stood together and demanded something better, and it started to disappear when people got individualistic and greedy. And as always, I want to make it clear that I am no expert on this topic. I am just a YouTuber who went down a rabbit hole and is presenting what I learned. And so I want to finish this video off with 3 takeaways that I personally learned from making this video. 1. Inequality is natural. The middle class is something you have to fight for. When we look back at history, inequality is sort of humanity's default state. When things go unchecked, you always end up with a handful of people at the top and a much bigger population at the bottom, but the middle class doesn't happen on its own. The middle class is something you have to fight for. It only exists when workers demand fair wages, when laws protect them, and when society decides that dignity shouldn't just belong to the rich. 2. Simplicity and frugality is how you build your rights. Now, I don't talk about frugality and living a simple life as much as I used to because it was honestly just time for me to make a change. But I still believe in living a very frugal and simple life because that's how you build your own rights in this world. So many people get trapped where they are because their living expenses are high, they're burdened by debt, or they don't have any savings, and so they're dependent on the system. The more financial security you build in your life and the more simplistic you live, the more options you're gonna have in life. You can take more risks, walk away from things, and speak up for yourself. Real freedom doesn't come from constantly seeking more, but it comes from needing less. And finally, unless people band together, things won't get better. If there's just one more lesson this story teaches us, it's that progress rarely comes from the top. Instead, it comes from the bottom, when people stand together, get organized, and demand better. But in today's world, we've forgot about that. We fight amongst each other, we blame marginalized groups, and we get distracted by extreme rhetoric, while people at the top keep getting richer and workers keep getting poorer. The only real power ordinary people have ever had is strength in numbers, and it's about time we remember that. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like, subscribe for more videos like it. I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments section. And if you want to hear another very interesting story about the real reason boomers are retiring broke, my #1 smash hit of the year, give this video a watch next. And with that, muchas gracias, que tengan un buen día. Nos vemos, chicos.